I just thought of a fun title for a video, and that would be uh, Don't Be Spiritual If You Want Some Level of Happiness, some level of peace, contentment. So I was thinking last night, and the thinking has continued. When I was younger, I would occasionally have, I guess, what some people would call spiritual experiences or feelings of being really in the flow of things, feeling very open to life and to reality, full of hope and optimism and peace and a sense of connection to things. And oftentimes those experiences are fine, but I would have an extra thought, which would be something like, oh, this is who I really am, or this is how things really should be, or could be maybe. But the main thought was, oh, this is who I truly am at the heart, at the core of who I am. Not the confused whatever, but it's this peaceful. And and I would, looking back, I would say that was a terrible thought to have. I know that in some circles that might be considered a true thought, but for myself looking back, I would say that was one of the worst thoughts I've generated or my brain has generated in my life. Uh, it created an enormous amount of unnecessary inner strife and suffering, and I want to explain why. Now, this goes hand in hand with another kind of an attitude, which is suppose that you have I don't know, go on a great vacation to Hawaii or with family or with friends or by yourself, and you have this amazing time, really connected to things, in the flow of things, and you think to yourself, wow, that's an amazing life. That's the kind of life I would like. So is there any way to make the rest of my life feel like that? And that's very similar, right? To think, oh, this connected or this deeply peaceful state is who I am. And is there any way to take the rest of my life to be more like that? And I think that that kind of thinking, that kind of impulse is fairly common. And I want to suggest, argue in this little video that that's probably one of the worst thoughts I think that a person can have. So going back to the original example, so I had this image of who I truly am or who I truly could be or who I truly want to be is this deeply peaceful, open, whatever person. And so there's the beginning of the formation of an identity around that version of myself. So if you think of this kind of like on a axis, like think of an X and Y axis, just think of the Y axis starting at 0 to 10. So I was living in those moments at a 9 or a 10. And that's who I was imagining myself to be. Now, I was young. I was in my 20s, early 20s, and kind of basically ignorant, stupid, whatever. And just unaware of the reality of living. And in particular, non-cognizant. Maybe if someone pointed it out to me, I would say, yeah, but not really cognizant of the fact that life is kind of like a zigzag or kind of a distorted sine wave, up and down, up and down. And so if I were to forget about who I wanted to be, who I aspired to be, who I didn't want to be, and so on, and simply looked at who I was in terms of my energy or my being, my inner state, I would say that a sine wave or some kind of modulating function would have described who I was. Sometimes I was up, sometimes I was down, and it was always fluctuating, and sometimes a little bit up, a little bit down, kind of going up and down, a little bit up for a while, and then a little bit down for a while, and so on. And I think that's the case for almost everybody. Things are always in flux. So when I identified or was beginning to identify with myself at the 9 or 10, then the way that I was telling some people last night was 90% of the time I was miserable. I was unhappy. Why? Because I imagined myself here. I imagined this is where I want to be, but 90% of the time, reality is I'm not there. So 90% of the time, I'm unhappy. And when I'm really at the bottom, the distance between where I was being near 1 or 2 to who I wanted to be or who I aspired to be or who I thought of myself as was so far that it was extra burdensome, it was extra miserable. And I say this because I think of people who sort of carry on as if they're very spiritual people. Many of them I would describe as a bit oversensitive and prone to depression and somewhat on the neurotic side of things, as I used to be. Uh, and I think part of it is because they hold their self image too high, it's out of touch with the reality. Their thinking isn't in sync with things as they are, with reality, but it's more that their thinking is more in sync with what they aspire toward instead of what is. And so one day I heard someone say, you should identify yourself, you should think of yourself as the average of who you can be. So in other words, at my height, spiritual heights, I might be at a 9 or 10. At my most depraved and just utterly self-centered, selfish aspect of myself, I was like at a 0 or 1. So my average was around a 5, just kind of ho-hum, ordinary human being. Nothing particularly especially great and nothing especially abject and miserable. And when I heard that, I realized that's who I'm going to see myself as. That's who I'm going to identify as, just the averages of myself. And what did that do for me? What it did for me was that when I would get on a spiritual high, I was no longer identifying myself with that state. I would just think, oh, I'm on kind of a spiritual high. I'm doing pretty good right now. But this won't last because that's not the mean. That everything, regression, the notion of regression to the mean. In other words, everything moving toward the averages. So this won't last. So that's great. I'll just enjoy it while it goes, and then I'll just take the ride down back to the mean, possibly beneath the mean. Whatever goes up must come down. So it would just kind of come down. So it wasn't a big deal. I didn't cling to these spiritual highs. So when the sense of spiritual vibrancy would fade, I wouldn't go into some kind of panic. Oh no, I'm losing my faith, or whatever a religious person might say. I would just be like, this thing wasn't going to last anyway. I was going, and then when things were really bad, I knew, oh, this is really bad. I feel really bad inside, but this also isn't going to last because that's not who I am either. That's not my mean. This also will regress to the mean. It'll go up. So the good and the bad, neither of them became a big deal. And just in my mind, at least, I became kind of medium, mediocre, ordinary. And it made the rest of my life easier. And it caused me so that I wouldn't make a big deal about the spiritual highs that I would before. And I wouldn't make a big deal about the very low times periods also, as I did before. It just became, that's just life. This is how things go, because I was looking at myself as the average. So I hope that going back, I forgot what I was going to title this. I'll have to watch it again so I can stick it on the YouTube video. But something like, I hope you can see that thinking of myself as a very spiritual or spiritual being is a problem. Instead, what I find is thinking of myself as the averages of who I seem to be is better. Now, when I see myself as this mediocre, average, ordinary human being, I can work on that person. I can slowly move that person up. I can become, in my case, more self-disciplined, be a little more rigorous in my practices and so on, to move that up slightly across years and decades. And the other thing I found is, rather than focusing on the spiritual side, I can focus on the low side. When I work on the things that are terrible or really not working in my life and improve them from like a 1 to a 2, right? So I'm not working on getting an 8 to a 10 or 9 to a 10. I'm working on the 1 and moving it to a 2. That's the same thing as moving an 8 to a 9 or 9 to a 10. But moving something from 1 to a 2 I find is much easier. It's much easier to work with something terrible and make it bad. But that causes an overall, if I see myself as like you can just think about this mathematically. If you have the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and you take their average, the average, wait, I don't want to, well, let's say it's 5. Is it 0 through 10 or, anyway, okay, anyway. but the average is 5. Now, if I change the 9 to a 10, I add 1 to the total, so now it's 5.1, the average. But moving a 9 to a 10 has the same effect as moving a 0 to a 1 or a 1 to a 2. And generally, I think if you'll reflect on your own life, you'll find that moving something from utterly miserable to kind of miserable is much easier than taking something that's great to amazing. It's just easier. And in fact, when I was getting my life coach training, one of the very first things that we were taught, and I don't always use this in my coaching, was when we first meet a client, we have a question that we ask. And the question is, oh, I forgot the question, but it's because I haven't used it in so long. But it's something like, what part of your life or what in your life is working the worst? That's not the phrasing actually, but something along those lines. In other words, point them to the thing that's the least fulfilling, what is the area of least satisfaction for you? That was the question. What is the area of life of least satisfaction? And the person would talk and we'd work on that. And just improving that to be mediocre would have the effect of moving the average up significantly more than taking something that's working fairly well into making it amazing. We sometimes think if I want an amazing life, I need to make things amazing. But it turns out that when we identify ourselves as the average of ourselves, it works easier and just as effective to work on the thing that's the least satisfying. So anyway, that's the video. I had no idea that this is what I was going to talk about. I don't know if you could tell by looking at my eye movements or just listening that I was just basically talking off the top of my head. But I just had the title, and I already forgot the title. But you'll remember the title because that's what I'll use as clickbait for this YouTube video. Hope you're having a good day. Bye.